So today I want to talk to you not just about asbestos in general, but about the specific type of asbestos, chrysotile, and how it's used globally and whether or not it should be regulated just like any other type of asbestos. So today I want to talk to you not just about asbestos in general, but about the specific type of asbestos, chrysotile, and how it's used globally and whether or not it should be regulated just like any other type of asbestos out there.
Okay, so first I want to talk to you a little bit about what asbestos is in general. So it's a term that's used to describe a group of 6 commercially available silicate materials with fibers that are generally long, thin, and flexible when separated. Asbestos is primarily used in a large number of commercial products due to the fact that it's fire resistant and their fibers are super strong. So it's used in building construction materials for insulation and also as fire retardant. It's also used in manufactured goods such as roofing shingles, ceiling and floor tiles, paper products, cement products, and friction products such as auto clutch, brake, and transmission parts. The fibers are classified into 2 different types, those being serpentine fibers, which are curly, and then also amphibole fibers, which are straight.
So as mentioned in the previous slide, there are 6 different types of asbestos classified into 2 different forms. There is serpentine asbestos and there is the amphibole asbestos. Most types of asbestos are found under the amphibole classification. There's amosite, chrysotile, tremolite, anthophyllite, and actinolite. Tremolite, anthophyllite, and actinolite are mostly referred to as contaminants and can be found in conjunction with other types of asbestos. On the other hand, there is the serpentine classification, and there's only one type of asbestos found in there, and that's chrysotile, which is the most commonly used form and can be found in many materials today globally. Although it's the most prevalent, there are some studies that show that it takes more exposure to chrysotile than other types of asbestos to develop related diseases, and that will come into play a little bit later in this presentation.
So, as mentioned previously, chrysotile asbestos is the most widely used asbestos globally. As of 1992, it accounted for over 98.5% of U.S. asbestos consumption. 90% is being employed in asbestos cement building materials, the largest users of which are developing countries, which comes into play and is very important later on in this presentation. Other uses include friction materials, textiles, and other applications. By the end of 2013, more than 50 countries, including member states of the European Union, have banned use of all forms of asbestos, including chrysotile. However, again, there are some countries that have maintained or even increased their production of chrysotile in recent years, a lot being in those developing countries. And the most prominent use is in the Asia Pacific region. And actually, until 2011, Canada was one of the main producers and exporters of chrysotile asbestos. To the right, you'll see a graph of all the different countries that produce and consume asbestos. And you'll see the main producers are China and South Africa, while some of the consumers include Zimbabwe, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Like many other hazardous materials, exposure comes in 2 different ways. There's the non-occupational exposure and occupational exposure. Non-occupational exposure can be thought of through domestic exposure. So if somebody is living with someone that actually works with asbestos, they mine asbestos, they work in a milling plant, it has been found that spouses and children that live with those individuals have been affected and exposed to asbestos. There's also air pollution from asbestos related industries or use of asbestos containing friction materials. So, for example, concentrations of asbestos are actually tenfold higher in urban locations. And detected mostly in busy traffic intersections due to those breaking materials that use asbestos. There's also some naturally occurring asbestos minerals that people are exposed to. When it comes to occupational exposure, it's estimated that 125 million people were exposed to asbestos in 2004, and that was mainly chrysotile being the most prevalent asbestos in the whole world. Um, it usually occurs within inhalation or ingestion within the following occupations: mining and milling, as mentioned before, manufacturing of products containing asbestos, and construction, automotive, and asbestos abatement industries. So, those individuals who go into houses that have asbestos and they remove that material are exposed.
So when exposure occurs to asbestos, typically fibers are inhaled, and although some of them are expelled, there are some that become lodged in the lungs and create these types of health effects. People are more likely to experience asbestos-related disorders when they are exposed to high concentrations, they're exposed to longer periods of time, and are exposed more often. Fibers of amphibole asbestos are retained longer in the lower respiratory tract than chrysotile fibers of the same dimension. And also, there are individual risk factors such as a person's history of tobacco use and other pre-existing lung diseases that could increase the risk of these health effects and possibly make them worse. The three most prevalent health effects that result from asbestos exposure, and especially chrysotile exposure, are asbestosis, which is a non-malignant lung disease that causes somebody to have difficulty breathing because the fibers of asbestos gets into the lungs and causes inflammation and scarring. There's also mesothelioma, which is a rare cancer found outside the lung in the lining of the chest cavity or the pleura of the lung or the abdominal contents. There's also lung cancer, which is a malignant tumor that invades and obstructs the lungs' air passages. And again, as stated before, smoking greatly increases the likelihood of a person who is exposed to asbestos developing this type of effect.
So, the World Health Organization actually looked at many different cohort studies that involved the adverse health effects of chrysotile asbestos. And through these different industries and locations, they were able to find that exposure and a majority of exposure to chrysotile was correlated with these different types of health effects, such as lung cancer, mesothelioma, and asbestosis. As you can see, there is a little exposure to amphibole asbestos, which has been an issue when trying to ban all types of asbestos globally. So there are obviously some serious public health concerns when it comes to asbestos exposure. According to global estimates stated by the World Health Organization, at least 170 people die each year from asbestos-related cancer and diseases resulting from occupational exposure. The latency period for exposure to the actual onset of the diseases is very long. It can be up to 20 years or more. So therefore, this burden of these diseases is on the rise, and it's not going to stop, even for countries that have banned the use of all types of asbestos. So, countries who still develop and use chrysotile asbestos have referenced studies showing it to be less harmful than the types of amphibole asbestos. Especially if handled in the right way, they believe that they can still utilize this form of asbestos and minimize the health effects. So, as previously alluded to in the slide before this, there was some presence of amphibole asbestos when it came to chrysotile asbestos exposure. So people who are supporters of the use of chrysotile asbestos have come up with this amphibole hypothesis, where it's not chrysotile that is causing these health effects, it's actually amphibole asbestos that are causing these health effects, and that's just due to the fact that chrysotile asbestos can be extracted from the lung faster, and due to the latency periods, people think that it's this amphibole asbestos that's causing these health effects. However, there have been some studies that have disproven this hypothesis. For example, when you're looking at lung burden studies, yes, chrysotile is cleared faster from the lung, so there's not really any, when you're looking at this, there's not really a lot of exposure or a lot of presence of chrysotile fibers in the lung. But when it's extracted, there have been studies that have found it actually in the plural, or the pleura of the lung, which is related to mesothelioma. Furthermore, the lung cancer response in studies of populations with pure chrysotile exposures is similar to that in studies of cohorts with amphibole or mixed exposures. So again, these types of studies disprove that amphibole hypothesis. Another issue is that most of these countries importing and using this form of asbestos, again, are developing countries that don't have the resources to correctly handle this type of asbestos, nor do they have the education. So, as of right now, there has been no evidence found for a threshold for the carcinogenic effect of asbestos, including chrysotile. Studies have found that populations exposed to very low levels still have increased cancer risks. So, judging from this, the most effective solution is to stop using all types of asbestos to eliminate asbestos-related diseases. The thought is that even though the chrysotile effect might be less than what an amphibole asbestos exposure effect is, there still is an effect, so there needs to be some kind of regulation associated with that. However, it's argued that many of these developing countries rely heavily on how inexpensive this material is, and their economy is very reliant on it. If that's the case, then there needs to be a tiered approach to the eventual elimination of asbestos, of all asbestos types, and using that within materials. First, there definitely needs to be an education approach. Right now, in the parties to the Rotterdam Convention, the prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticide in international trade, it's chrysotile asbestos isn't listed at all under Annex 3, which requires the informed consent of a country to import a material. So if that just gets added into that, then countries will be informed of what the potential effects are to using chrysotile. In addition, there needs to be some type of education and maintenance of how this type of asbestos is handled. And right now, I think it's very difficult for developing countries to kind of monitor that, but there needs to be some kind of increase in that monitoring of how it's handled. And eventually, this should lead to the elimination of asbestos related diseases, or asbestos, of all types of asbestos. And hopefully within that time period, an alternate type of material can be developed and used to replace asbestos.